congratulate him and celebrate him. So let's give him a round of applause.
Thank you, all of you, for being here. I was not expecting just this family of people to be here, and that really is what this place is. Both faculty and students, and even my direct family are here, and this is a special place to be. So thank you, and I want to thank all my friends and family who are attending on the live stream at home, and in particular, I want to address the big elephant in the room, who my baby April was born this past week on Tuesday, on Pi Day. So she and Mom Meredith are watching from home on her couch and getting rested and everything. She came in at a very small 5 pounds, 14 ounces, and she's perfect, absolutely perfect. And you don't realize until after a baby is born that you realize that everything you've been doing has been for them, and that was the big revelation. So I was literally working on this presentation in the hospital last week, but I'm so glad she's here. So I'm glad she can be a part of this. So let's hop in, and let's look at this word salad of a title here: the effects of error magnitude and confluence on instrumental music educators' evaluation and remediation of performances. And to break that down a little bit, what sort of was the inspiration of this study was, one, as a young teacher, as a young band director back in the day, and those of you who are about to be novice band directors and choir teachers and orchestra directors in the future, you'll deal with some nerves when you're in front of your classroom for the first time, and you'll realize that there's a lot of things to process at the same time. It would be a perfect world if we went up in front of our ensembles and you go and you perform and you cut them off and only one thing went wrong. Little Russell Greene on the French horn, he came in a little bit early, or he played a B natural instead of a B flat. Nothing else was wrong with the performance, just that. And so it's really obvious what to fix. But rarely does that happen, right? When you go and you do a rehearsal, there's all kinds of things that are going wrong. People coming in and out of the wrong locations and times, playing out of tune, playing wrong notes, balance and blend being all over the place, or even if they're not playing incorrectly, they're playing something that is different from your ideal version of what a performance should be, okay? And so expert teachers are really, really good at, after they cut off the ensemble, they know exactly what to fix first. But what we see in novice teachers is they tend to struggle with that a little bit, okay? So to break down this title a little bit, error magnitude refers to the intensity of performance errors. How intense does a performance error have to be to draw your attention to it? And then confluence, how many errors going on at the same time is too much for you to process? Okay, so we're looking at the combination of those two things. And then I looked at how novice or pre-service teachers, undergraduates, compare in their evaluations compared to in-service or expert teachers. Okay, see if there's any differences in those two groups. Okay, so let's look at a little bit of the background of what we do know about what makes effective teachers. Our very own Harry Price from the University of Alabama put out research and came up with this idea of the teaching cycle. Effective teachers are really good at fast cycles of teaching throughout their rehearsals. This happens multiple times a minute, where they tell the students to do something, the students do it, or they respond to a question or a prompt, and then as the students are performing, the teacher is evaluating their performance and then giving them feedback, which then turns directly into a new direction or a prompt to do something else, or to do the same thing in a different way. Again, these teaching cycles occur multiple times throughout a rehearsal. But in order to do those things requires a lot of different skills. You have to have an auditory image or a visual image of what you want them to do. And if you don't have that defined image, then it's difficult to know whether what they did was correct or not. Okay, so you take that idea, you compare it to reality. Okay, you discriminate between those two things. You detect or discriminate the errors. And then once you've done that, you prescribe a solution that will help you get from reality to the ideal. Okay? That's actually a lot of skills, and we're hopefully teaching you that right now here at the University of Alabama. And what research has shown is that novice and pre-service teachers struggle with all aspects of this. Okay? their ability to actually detect the errors because they don't yet have a developed auditory image of what they want to hear, and they have trouble diagnosing the true causes of those performance problems, actually giving the right cause for the solution, and then having a breadth of knowledge, a toolkit of things that they can use to actually solve those problems, okay? And so we'll talk about how we can develop those things. So let's talk about things that actually affect your ability to detect errors. And two terms to get familiar with here. Acuity is just your ability to actually detect that there is an error, and your accuracy is whether or not the error that you detected is correct, okay? Hearing an audio example before you hear a student perform increases your accuracy. That makes sense. You have an ideal image of what they should sound like, you compare it to what they did, and you can make those discriminations. Okay, that makes sense. However, almost counterintuitively, listening to a student perform multiple times before you give them feedback actually diminishes your ability to detect the correct error because you're almost searching for things. Whereas if you had just listened to them once, commented on that performance, you give the best feedback possible rather than hearing them multiple times. We have greater error detection accuracy in tonal music versus atonal music because of the context of incorrect notes. Okay? It's kind of hard to figure out when something's wrong in atonal music sometimes. Something that's interesting and will be the impetus for much of this study is that texture, musical texture, decreases your acuity as well. So the more voices there are, the more variables that are added into the mix, the harder it is to detect errors. And also, those with music education degrees have shown to have greater error detection accuracy and acuity compared to music performance majors. And this is also a skill that improves with experience. Okay? It has been shown that over time, as you have more experience in the classroom, your ability to hear those errors improves. And when we're talking about error detection, maybe there is also some sort of hierarchy of different error types that we hear over others. Are we more likely to hear a wrong note versus a wrong rhythm, or balance and blend issues, or dynamic issues? What are our preferences, and what are we most able to hear? Well, a lot of the research has kind of really only been limited to two different types of error types, and those are pitch and rhythm errors. Okay, a lot of the other things have yet to be investigated. And what we know so far from a lot of studies by LSU's Jim Bio is that rhythm errors are easier to detect than pitch errors. Okay? The only case where this is not true is in a full ensemble texture, where there's, again, lots of different variables going on. It seems easier to detect pitch errors compared to rhythm errors. And so there seems to be conditions that affect our ability to detect errors. Okay? So what we don't know, everything else. Any type of error, we're not quite sure where they fall on this spectrum of hierarchy. What are we more likely to detect, and what conditions affect, when they're going on at the same time, our ability to detect those errors? Beyond that, we also know that in addition to just time and experience, you can actually learn to be good error detectors. There's been a full body of research in this field, and error detection training programs have involved what we call prepared errors, where they essentially take an excerpt and they intentionally put an error in there, or they plant it, and then you, the student or the observer, watches or listens to the performance and see if they can identify the error, and then it's reinforced to the user whether or not they got it. Okay, very, very simple task. A model for this dissertation was the James Frosseth MLR Visual Diagnostic Test, where essentially participants see a picture of a student in a playing position. They get 12 seconds to watch them, and then they get a list of choices to say, okay, what did you think was wrong? And then after they select their choice, another slide comes by and says, here was the correct answer. Did you answer correctly? If you did not, here's why. And so you get reinforcement on good error detection technique. And this model, again, is what sort of served as the study format today. So just a brief summary of all of the error detection research. We know that error detection skills can be trained in addition to just developing it over time. It seems that some errors are more detectable than others, but it's not clear what the full hierarchy is, what the big pyramid is, and it seems to be that texture confounds your ability to detect errors, meaning that there are just too many variables to process. And it's that idea there that takes us into the next body of research, which is our ability to process multiple things at the same time, or multivariate reasoning. Okay? We do this all the time. When you're driving on the interstate, you're weaving in through traffic, you're calculating how fast you're going versus your safety, how fast you want to go if you're in a rush. You're doing all sorts of calculations. We live in a multivariate world, but we actually struggle with this. So when we're talking about the research of multivariate reasoning, they essentially look at what we do when we observe an observed effect or event, and then try to determine what caused those things. Let's use a musical example. If we're watching Little Russell Greene play for Professor Sneed and he sounds bad, he has bad tone quality, what would be a cause of that poor tone quality? Well, most of us would probably say, use more air. In fact, that's a common panacea in the music world. Use more air. But it's actually a little bit more complex than that, right? It's not just air speed, right? It is how strong is the formation of their embouchure? Where is their tongue being placed in the mouth? Is it constricting airflow? What is the oral cavity shape? Or is there any deformities in how the mouth is being shaped? How are they sitting? Are they breathing correctly? Are they playing on good equipment? And maybe it's just a hot, humid day, and that's affecting the temperature of the air and how air is traveling through the volume, right? So yes, the obvious answer seems to be just airspeed, but it's actually all kinds of things in confluence with each other, right? It's not quite as simple as that. It's a balance of all of these things at once. And so our tendency to pick one variable instead of a plurality of variables is what we call satisficing. Okay, you're satisfied by one particular thing. And usually it's the most extreme or most obvious variable. Okay, so the process of this is you're given a choice to make a decision of a cause and effect, right? There's a list of options presented to you. You select the first option or the most obvious one, and then you're done. Okay, you don't do any further investigations. Okay, higher advanced thinking goes beyond that and we develop bigger thresholds of satisfaction, and we go back and we reevaluate those options, and we consider the plurality in the interaction of causes and effects, okay, instead of just one. So an example in the general sciences, a lot of research has been done on multivariate reasoning and deductive reasoning in the general sciences. Not a whole lot of this has been done in music quite yet. And a big name is Deanna Kuhn, who did a lot of studies with middle school age students and gave them the opportunity to participate in science activities that allowed them to predict whether an avalanche would occur. Okay, and they would say, and it would be on a little computer program, and it would say, we know that these things cause avalanches, whether or not there was sunlight that day, or what the weather was, how hot it was, or what the humidity was, what's the density of the snow on the mountain, or is it a steep angle on the slope, or is it flat? And again, it's not any one of these things, it is a combination of all of these things and our ability to predict whether an avalanche occurs. And so essentially the students would be given different levels of all of these variables, and then they would say, predict whether an avalanche would occur. And what they observed was, more often than not, they would pick one variable instead of lots of different variables. And what they picked was the variable that was at the most extreme value. It was really hot that day, so there had to have been an avalanche. Or it's a really steep mountain, so there's gonna be an avalanche. But it's a combination of all of those things. But what they did see was that when they gave the students the opportunity to test the effects of each variable, imagine a giant mixing board of life where you can raise the levels of slope and temperature and humidity, and you can see what the observable effect is. When they were able to do that, their understanding of multivariate relationships and causality increased. And so I'm thinking, how can we do that in music? How can we give pre-service teachers the ability to test and manipulate causes of performance effects and understand the things that they can use to remediate their future students? So a brief summation of all the multivariate reasoning research is that at the expense of interpreting the relationships of many variables, causes and problems are often interpreted as singularities rather than pluralities. And it seems to be that the magnitude of a variable, the intensity of a variable, completely warps your perception of its causality. Okay? And then we have seen that understanding of multivariate causality can be trained, can be practiced, can be developed. Okay, so the purpose of this study was to examine how magnitude and the combination, the confluence of performance errors affect both pre-service and in-service music educators' evaluations of student performances, how they rate a performance, and how they choose what to fix with those students, their prioritization of remediation targets. Okay? So, what did we do? Well, two groups of participants were involved in this study. 146 undergraduate or pre-service instrumental music education majors throughout the state of Alabama and in Kentucky. They were contacted either directly by me through their professors, and I would go and visit their schools and give them a link to participate in an online survey. I say it's a survey, but it's really a collection of stimulus videos that they would participate in evaluating. The other group were 60 secondary instrumental music educators. Secondary just means middle school or high school. And they were band or orchestra teachers. And these were contacted via a variety of means through the National Association of Music Education listserv. There was a distribution throughout the country, and also through the AMEA newsletter in the month of October. And then I also sent direct emails to colleagues of mine that I know throughout the state. So we had 146 undergraduate students. We had 60 middle school and high school band director and orchestra directors. And what did they see? Well, after responding to some demographic questions indicating what their primary instrument was, how many years they've been teaching, their year in college, they then saw a tutorial video, how to participate in the study. Then they saw 11 videos. Okay, everyone saw a different random presentation of 11 videos, and every video looked like this. On the bottom, you see the sheet music of a 4-measure excerpt that was composed specifically for this study, and it's meant to be in a comfortable range for a middle school or high school French horn player. Okay? You might be asking, well, why French horn, Russell? Well, only one instrument was used in this study so that we can control the variance of having all kinds of instruments in there, and by having the participants indicate to me what their primary instrument was, I could use that as a system of control. Okay? So then, in addition to the sheet music on the bottom, up on top, they saw 3 different images of a student in a seated playing position with their instrument. The picture on the left was zoomed out so that they could see the overall picture of the student, observe their posture, how they were sitting and holding with the instrument. In the middle was a little bit zoomed up on their left hand and on their embouchure so they could see how those two things were settled on the instrument. And then on the right picture, we see a zoomed up of their right hand position so they could evaluate how that is being done correctly in the picture. So then after they clicked on the video, turned it into full screen, they would hear something like this. And they were tasked to only watch the video once, right? Because as we know from prior research, listening to it multiple times, they may surmise errors that aren't there. We want their initial response to what they saw. And so after they watched the performance, saw what was on screen, listened carefully to what they heard, they then had 2 tasks. 1, just give me a flat-out rating of the performance, your initial impressions on a scale of 1 to 5, with 1 being major performance errors, and 5 being an ideal or perfect performance. And they were able to grab the nod there and then just move it along the scale. This gave us the performance rating variable, which we'll get to in a minute. The second step was we listed 8 different error types that were manipulated in this study, and then they could grab these and move them into a rank order with the most important on top and the least important on bottom in terms of what they wanted to address with the student. So if they listened to the performance and they were really concerned about the tempo consistency of that student, they would grab tempo and move it to the top. And then they would go down and down and down and down and down until the thing that they cared the least about was at the bottom. Okay? This gave us 2 different things. a remediation ranking variable for each individual one, okay, on a scale of 1 to 8, right? 1 being most important, 8 being least. And then also a ranking for the macro groups of those variable types. I group them into audio variables, ones that they could hear, and then visual variables, ones that they could see in the pictures, okay? And then we can compare those two. And we'll get back to that in a moment. So then there were a total of 56 videos used in this study, one of which was errorless, no errors at all. We needed something to compare them to. Amongst the remaining 55, only 2 variables were manipulated in each video. Those 8 variables were tone, pitch, rhythm, tempo, articulation, the formation of the embouchure and where the mouthpiece was on the lips, how they were holding the instrument carriage, and how they were sitting in the chair with their posture. Were they slumped over? Was their neck tilted? And so of those 8, again, only 2 errors were manipulated at a time, and they were presented at similar levels of error magnitude. They could either be errorless, low error magnitude, so a bit of a problem, but not too great, and high error magnitude. This is really a problem. And the levels of these were tested through 4 different pilot studies in the lead up to this, where we got expert feedback in terms of are these serious problems or not. Okay, 2 variables were only delivered at 1 level of magnitude, that was embouchure and carriage, and that was because representations of those 2 variables at low error magnitude didn't seem to be significantly different from the high error magnitude and the no error. Okay, so that also limited and helped reduce the number of videos we had, because if there's no difference, there's no point in testing. Okay, so 8 different errors, 5 of which are audio type, 3 of which are visual type, and then 3 levels of magnitude. Each participant saw 11 videos randomly, 5 of which were low error magnitude, 5 were high error magnitude, and 1 no errors at all. So everyone saw the errorless version. Okay, so here's an example of an errored version, okay, where a student is performing a high error magnitude version of a rhythm error and a high error magnitude version of a tone error. In this case, they're playing 5 incorrect rhythms, and they're playing with a very clenched jaw where it's hard for the air to escape the embouchure. By the way, Matt Meadows was a great candidate and helped me record all of these. To have somebody to do that on call immediately is a certain level of expertise, so I'm very grateful to him. So let's check this out so you can get an understanding of what's going on here. Yeah, so you hear a couple of incorrect rhythms there, right? They cut off the dot in some. In fact, they cut those dotted quarters into dotted eighths. There was some, the straight eighth notes were turned into dotted eighths. So some incorrect rhythms there, and you could hear the tenseness of the tone quality. Okay, so then after they observed that, they would rate the performance and then rank those 8 variables in terms of what they wanted to address. All right, so just to clarify and put it into pure terms, we have 3 independent variables here. 1, error magnitude, the intensity of those errors. 2, pairing type, okay, so we have audio errors being paired together, audio and visual errors being paired together, and then visual and visual errors being paired together. And so we looked at the differences in those confluences of error types. And then we also looked at teaching status, pre-service teachers versus in-service teachers. How did they rate things and how did they rank things? Then the dependent variables, again, the performance rating, and then 2 different remediation rankings, one for all of the audio variables, one for all the visual variables, and then also for the individual errors. What was the propensity of a particular variable to be ranked towards the top or ranked towards the bottom? So let's take a look at what we found. So when we look at the effect of error magnitude on the performance rating, as error magnitude increased, so from errorless to low error magnitude to high error magnitude, the performance rating went down, which is what we would hope to see, right? Which means, 1, that the representations of error magnitude in this study adequately showed diminishing performance quality, and that all of the participants were capable of detecting that diminishment, okay? When we look at the effect of error magnitude on the rankings of visual variables versus audio variables, okay? Here in this graph, we have orange being visual errors and blue being audio errors. And I want to point out, too, that in this graph, The y-axis is inverted. So where we have the numbers going going down as we go up, that means that the rank is going lower, but their priority is increasing, right? As we go closer to 1, that's a higher priority of remediation. And as it goes closer to 8, right, that is a lower priority of remediation. And since there is no true 0 here, you can't have rank 0, you can only have rank 1, the median rank is 4.5. So imagine if something is above 4.5, that means it's closer towards being more prioritized. And if it's below that, that means it's less prioritized. And so what we saw was that at low error magnitude, visual errors were more prioritized for remediation, meaning that both pre-service and in-service teachers were more likely to remediate carriage, embouchure, and posture over all of the audio errors. Okay? This was not true in the errorless condition, where there really wasn't a priority one way or the other, and at high error magnitude, which was very interesting, which meant that you can see how these two converge here at the center here. They both meet essentially 50% distribution towards one way or the other, which indicates that at high error magnitude, their attention was drawn towards the most egregious error. Okay? Let's go further. Looking at pairing type. Okay, so visual-visual, audio-visual, and audio-audio pairings. All of these were lower than the errorless condition. We would expect that. As error types are introduced, of course, the rating's going to go down. What was really interesting was that certain error types were rated more poorly than others. Okay, and it seems that error pairings that had audio errors in them were ranked lower than those with visual errors. Okay, so it didn't matter what they saw. If they saw that they had poor posture, or they didn't have a good setup on their embouchure or how they were holding the instrument, if it sounded good, then they were going to give it a higher rating. But if it sounded poorly, then they were going to give it a lower rating. Okay? Well, where this becomes even more interesting is when we look at the rankings of the individual error types and the macro group rankings. So again, we have visual errors in orange, and we have audio errors in blue. In all error type combinations, visual errors were targeted for remediation over audio error types, except for in audio-audio. So what does this mean? When only audio errors are present, then they are going to choose to remediate audio problems. But in all other instances, they were more likely to fix embouchure, carriage, and posture first before remediating the actual musical problem. Okay? So even though performance ratings went down with if it sounded worse, they were more likely to fix the visual problems. Okay? All right, let's look at differences between pre-service and in-service teachers. So when we look at the actual performance rating variable, there was no difference between the two groups, which is actually nice to see because their abstract idea of a diminishing performance quality is the same between the two groups. And what this means is that if we want to find differences between those two groups, we look at how they actually choose to remediate the performances. Well, how do they do that? The most interesting thing actually occurred in the errorless condition. Pre-service teachers here on the left, okay, were kind of indiscriminate. If there was no errors, they may choose to remediate a visual or an audio or whatever. But in-service teachers, when no errors were present, were more likely to remediate the visual errors. What does this say? When we cut off our groups in middle school band, okay, the first thing that all of us do is look around and say, Johnny, I like the way that you're sitting. Russell, do you mind coming and sitting up in your chair? Oh, everyone fix your posture, right? There are these behaviors associated with remediating these fundamental habitual behaviors, right? And developing good habit strength. This ties back into lots of Bob Duke's books. So there is a default remediation behavior that in-service teachers do that is tied to fundamental remediation, whereas pre-service teachers haven't quite gotten there yet. They're still trying to figure out what they want. When we bring all of the data in, including the errorless and also all of the pairing types and error magnitudes, again, in-service teachers tended to prioritize their remediation of visual errors over audio errors. Pre-service teachers did this as well, but not to the extent that in-service teachers did. Okay. When we look at an interaction effect, this is where we take two different independent variables and see how they interact together and affect one particular dependent variable. When we look at how teaching status interacted with pairing type, here we have in the orange, in-service teachers, and in blue, pre-service teachers. And this is how they remediated visual errors. Okay, so we can see that in all cases of pairing types, in-service teachers tended to prioritize the remediation of visual errors over pre-service teachers. The only case where this did not occur was when only visual errors were occurring. Okay? Let's go back to that multivariate reasoning conversation, where the most obvious error is the one that we tend to focus on. Well, that seems to be what pre-service teachers are doing, whereas in-service teachers are thinking more about multivariate causality and thinking about how if they can fix the fundamentals and the habits, and those will affect auditory and musical outcomes, pre-service teachers are looking at what's the most obvious error and how do I fix that? Okay? So we got to be thinking about how we can train undergraduates to be thinking more in that causality mindset. When we look at the individual rankings of different error types going beyond just the macro grouping, the tendency for pre-service teachers to prioritize the remediation of audio variables was most seen in the prioritization of remediating articulation and tempo. And then in-service teachers, where they tended to prioritize visual errors, that was most seen in their prioritization of embouchure and carriage. Okay? But what was really, really interesting was that their prioritization of remediating embouchure changed depending on whether or not the embouchure error presented with an audible problem. So if they saw that the embouchure wasn't quite sitting right on their face, but they didn't hear anything wrong with the performance, they were less likely to remediate it. But if they saw the error going on here and they heard a poor performance, they're like, yes, I need to fix that. So there's a shifting level of priority going on here, whether or not that's a good thing or not, okay? Because maybe we're ignoring underlying problems and how the embouchure is being formed and saving it for later, doing some sort of risk calculation. But there's an interesting level of shifting priority there. Okay, so what are the main takeaways? Based on this study and the results of this study, it seems that both error magnitude and pairing type significantly affected both the performance ratings and remediation rankings. Performance ratings decreased as error magnitude increased, and it seemed that error types with audio errors in them were ranked lower or rated lower than those with visual error types. But where it became interesting is that visual errors were more targeted for remediation over audio errors, looking at issues of causality, fixing fundamentals first, and building good habits. It also seems that teaching status significantly affected remediation rankings, but not the performance ratings, right? They rated similarly, but where they chose to remediate the performances was different. In-service teachers prioritized the remediation of visual errors, including in the errorless stimulus, which indicates default remediation behaviors, and demonstrated a greater understanding of causation. Pre-service teachers were indiscriminate or tended to remediate the obvious error type rather than thinking about causality. They satisficed, right? They found the most satisfactory answer first before looking further. And it seemed that in-service teachers had a shifting calculus of when to address embouchure, which seemed only to occur when it had an audible musical issue going on alongside it. So what does this mean for the future? Well, pre-service and in-service teachers seem to have since they have a similar performance rating, have similar abstract notions of diminishing performance quality, but where they differ is how they choose to remediate performances. But we do know that error detection, multivariate processing, and deductive reasoning can be trained. So future music education research should look at how increasing levels, just like in this study, of error magnitude and confluence affect remediation decisions. In this study, we only looked at 2 error types at once. But again, that's a largely more perfect world than reality. Many more error types are occurring all at once, and our ability to sift through the sea of those things and thin slice what we need to fix, that's what needs to be further investigated. And so music teacher training programs, undergraduate music education programs should allow music teachers to tinker with and experiment and observe and evaluate the effects of performance error causes through the scientific method, right? Test and evaluate and observe. And then they deserve to have more authentic context teaching scenarios, so lab ensembles, where they can be up in front of a podium and get to stretch out and work on their teaching muscles and their remediation tasks, right? So that was a whirlwind. Thank you so much for being here, and I hope you enjoyed it, and I look forward to receiving questions from the committee. So thank you.
Okay, we will now take a minute to transition. Our committee members